Hello everyone, I'm Redbeard, and today we will be looking at Slaanesh in the next DLC, as it is a sure bet that they're going to want to finish out the Monogod Quartet before moving on to another DLC, likely going to be Dogs of War after. For the legendary lore, Dechala is the most obvious next choice. She was once an Azure princess, so it makes sense she would be pitted against the Dark and High Elves. She is known for devastating Ind, and is mutated to be snake-like, so opening Ind and Koresh on the map with this DLC also makes good sense. Now, I won't go too much into her lore here. I may do a lore video closer to when the DLC releases, but you can always check out the Lorebeards episode, which is like a deep dive into Decala's lore and everything you would need to know. But for the TLDR, Dechala was a high elf from Nagaryth. She became the victim or the target of the demon prince of Slaanesh, Samael, who would go on to torture her family for years. Eventually, her father conceded and gave Dechala over to the demon prince Samael. In turn, Samael convinces her to butcher her family for giving her away as such, betraying her. And then eventually, she would become Samael's equal in power as a follower of Slaanesh. She would become the quote-unquote denied one because Slaanesh would not make her a demon prince until she kills her former partner, Samael. So then she would go on to grow the greatest Slaaneshi warband that ever existed, Decala's Tormentors, which would be her faction name, and potentially her unique mechanic, as it might be similar to gathering Temperkins chieftains. Maybe she uses her elixirs, because she's known to be almost a witch, and that she brews these very, very potent elixirs. But perhaps that could be a currency to buy these Tormentors, these unique Slaaneshi champions, who come with unique buffs and units from other rosters. Again, much like Temperkins chieftains. And then finally, interestingly enough, she is never detailed as to when she becomes heavily mutated, even though she's not a demon prince, so I guess that means she's technically a chaos spawn. So yeah, when she is brought to Total War, I imagine Games Workshop will be nailing down some of these details, because typically it is impossible for an elf to have any mutations or become a chaos spawn. But as with Dechala, that is not 100% true. There's also a character I'll talk about a little bit more named Gilberion, who was an elf lord at one point that becomes hugely mutated. But yeah, now let's move on to how Dechala works in battle. So what will this Slaaneshi centerpiece do? She slithers forth at top speed. She should be a nightmare for infantry. She becomes a whirlwind of steel as she coils, strikes, and constricts. She has 6 arms, each wielding a separate poison-laced sword. Unlike Nakari or Azazel, though, she would be outfitted with a set of chaos armor. She has 3 passive dances that she should be able to switch upon the fly, sort of like war dancer units or black orcs with the bulwark. First being Dagger Dance, which may give her armor and melee defense. Second is Dance of Destruction, giving weapon strength and melee attack. Last is Praise of Slaanesh, giving speed and mass. Of course, this is just me interpreting from tabletop rules, so it may be a little different than that. Her Elixir of Damnation mutates its victims, leaving them in the grip of pain and ecstasy, unable to oppose Dechala. Perhaps this unique item grants the ability to summon Chaos Spawn of Slaanesh, similar to how Arbal does. The real kicker, though, is that anyone she hits or that hits her is rendered useless with a paralyzing poison. As to not be overpowered, though, perhaps it only lasts for 20 to 30 seconds and can't apply to the same affected unit until after a 60-second cooldown. At some point in her campaign, she should have a quest battle to defeat Samael, the demon prince who started her ascent into Slaaneshi worshipper. While he exists, though, she can never fully ascend, so killing him will give her the demonic rule. She's also known for gathering a war band of tormentors, which I would love to act like Tamerkin's chieftains for southern Slaanesh. Mirroring that mechanic, the Decala's tormentors should primarily pull from Dark Elves. A standard Chaos Lord, but also a Medusa, fits for obvious reasons. Centigors are very Slaanesh in their culture, so that's our Beastman character. And if we could be so lucky, I would love to see Ind and Koresh Slaanesh variants for our more exotic choices, since she is known for operating in these lands. A Naga and Rakshasa Tigerman could be cool. For her starting position, Dechala will hopefully open up Ind and start there. And while she's at it, I would very much like it if Arbal and Gorbad moved to Ind. Dechala, Arbal, Gorbad. I think those three characters should really move to Ind. Gorbad because of the fact that Gorfang should be an FLC character at some point and should be in the Black Crag starting position, not Gorbad. Gorbad's most loreful start position is Iron Rock, and I've talked of this before, but I also think he could have started in Urzag's old position, Ekrend, or Fort Sol, so that he could be closer to Solent, and be, he destroyed that province out of history, essentially. So, those places. But my favorite start position, I said, was, well, since we haven't heard of him in hundreds of years, maybe he went to some far-flung land like Cathay or Ind. So, again, I think Ind would be a great start position for all those characters. Arbal is in rivalry with Dechala, though. So, it makes a lot of sense for those two to be the Chaos factions that are within the borders of Ind. Now, hopefully, at some point, CA might be saving opening up the Ind portion of the map for an actual Ind race, one would hope in an ideal world. But again, all we can really bet on at this point is that Dogs of War will be we will get at least one more race pack. Then, for the FLC Lord, the Masque of Slaanesh is the most obvious choice. As with the Changeling, Epidemius, and Ujul, it would seem we are getting all the Heralds as Lords. I could have argued at one point that at least Epidemius and the Masque should be legendary heroes. At this point, it just makes sense that we get all the lesser demons, essentially. Characters as legendary lords. She is cursed to eternally dance by Slaanesh himself, so her animations would be much like Urzag, so she would not have a Seeker mount, but could probably still dance on a Seeker chariot, or a Chaos War Shrine of Slaanesh, or perhaps even a unique palanquin of some sort. She would focus on buffing demonettes through performing different dances, perhaps as her campaign mechanic. And much like Dechala, we have 3 named dances. But again, I think for Dechala, her 3 dances are a battle mechanic. And for Masque, the 3 dances are campaign mechanics. So it says in the Dance of Dreaming, where the slumbering prince waits to be born, the Masque and her chorus drift in sedentary and languid movements. So for this mechanic, I think it should be less about buffing your armies and more about buffing your settlements, provinces, regions, and such. Perhaps, in this, your armies move a bit slower, so you'll have less campaign movement range while this dance is active. But your economy, growth, defense, corruption, all these things are going to be stronger in the Dance of Dreaming. Conversely, in the Pageant of Pain, reenacting one of Slaanesh's great victories over Khorne, is a tableau of spasmodic movements that ends with the entranced cast tearing at each other's throats and eyes. Not all the dances are from the past, they are drawn from all points in time. So perhaps while this dance is active, not only your armies, but enemy armies in the same region will all suffer attrition, but your armies will have buffs to their melee capabilities. So any and all melee stats will be buffed while this dance is active. Especially your Demonette and Seeker units. The power of the Masque's curse allows her to recreate events yet to come, from the caging of Loic and the purging with fire of Nurgle's garden, all the way up to the legendary Rangkandanra, the final battle in Twilight of the Gods. Any who survive these manifestations have only the scantest memories of what truly occurred. They see only the ruin and death around them, feel only the bone-weary agony of a body pushed beyond its limits. Meanwhile, and elsewhere, the Masque dances on. So this one's a little harder to decipher into how it would work as a gameplay campaign mechanic, but my idea for it is that while this dance is active, you get an army ability to summon Chaos Spawn of Slaanesh. Additionally, before battle, you can steal an extra unit or two that you wouldn't have been able to otherwise if this dance were not active. Hinting at the notion that any who survive these manifestations have only the scantest memories of what truly occurred. So, you stole them over to your army, they worked for you. If they survived, they don't really remember. But that is just my interpretation. It wouldn't be a huge mechanic, but again, like at Epidemius, I see the Masque being very along the same lines of kind of just a simple lord. And my idea is that these dances, like every 5 turns or so, you'll choose which dance you want to have active. But you have to choose one of the dances. Now, before I say who I think the legendary hero should be, I want to say that there are 4 Slaanesh characters that I would like to see brought to the game, beyond Dechala and Masque. The first being Styrkaar of the Swordsfinare, who in lore is a lord, and I would like to be the 4th Slaanesh lord, maybe as FLC sometime in the future, or as part of a character pack, let's say for the end times, that gives 1 lord to every race, or something along those lines. Now, I will admit he would fill a very similar niche within Decala's Tormentors as Kais the Befouled does within Temerkhan's Chieftains, being the ultimate captain of your monstrous cavalry options, as his famous mount is a Serpent of Slaanesh, and it is very likely that we will get these monstrous cavalry as a unit within this Slaanesh DLC. Let's say Pleasure Seekers, as they were called in tabletop, for Demonettes, and then Knights could just be called Pleasure Knights. Whether Lord or Hero, Styrkaar should be the guy that buffs that monstrous cavalry of Slaanesh. But there is also a character who I think can fill that same niche as a Kais the Befouled type chieftain. Now that is Gilberion, who, as far as we know, didn't have any mounts. But I think it is very easy to go ahead and put him on a Serpent of Slaanesh. He is even heavily mutated, such as Kaisk. He possesses characteristic Slaaneshi mutations, such as an ensnaring tongue, extra joints in his arms, the face of a demonette, the ability to cast magic from the lore of Slaanesh, multiple arms that end in razor-sharp claws, and tentacles to boot. I also think he fits way better alongside Dechala, as he was originally an elf lord, such as Dechala, and his title is even the Denied Lord much like Dechala, the Denied One. So personally, I would choose Gilberion as the legendary hero, and Styrkaar as a 4th FLC legendary lord for Slaanesh, and the final legendary lord for Slaanesh. So what about the other 2 characters? Vandred the Majestic. I've said before, I'll say it again, he should be one of Archaon's lieutenants. Just like Tamarkan has his chieftains, just like Marcus Wolfhard has his hunters, just like, hopefully, Dechala has her tormentors, Archaon should eventually get his friggin' lieutenants. And Dorgar should be able to turn into a chimera. But that's a video for another day. But Archaon should get his lieutenants, Vandred the Majestic for Slaanesh, Hargroth the Blooded for Khorne, Fator the Tainted for Nurgle, and Sisbeth for Tzeentch. Also, Melik the Changer was technically the Tzeentch lieutenant, and Styrkaar took over Vandred's spot as lieutenant at some point. But Vandred, Fator, Hargroth, Sisbeth. Because Styrkaar and Melik, I think, should be legendary lords, the 4th for their faction. But as far as what Vandred does, he should be actually pretty similar to Dechala on the battlefield in that his lower half of his body is a giant serpent, and then the top half, his former elf self. But he has, in his model, 4 arms, just 2 less than Dechala. And it can be very much assumed that he would be an anti-infantry blender. Finally, our last character, Nastasya Raskolnikov. She is a born Kislevite that would later become a Slaanesh worshipper and sorcerer, a recent convert to the Warped Banner of Chaos, and is a bearer of the Mark of Slaanesh. Her mutant skin has the appearance of silver and the resilience of iron. So essentially think of her as if the doppelgangers of Zarina Katerin and Balthazar Gelt had a child, that would essentially be Nastasya Raskolnikov. Even before her conversion to the service of the Dark Prince, she had possessed a burning passion for arcane knowledge, but only a novitiate in mastery of magic. Slaanesh has greatly enhanced her sorcerer's skills and given her 2 magic items, which enable her to turn an enemy's armies fury on itself. Nastasya Raskolnikov has been driven mad by dreams granted by Slaanesh, which have convinced her that she is the rightful Tsarina of Kislev. She is determined to claim the throne from its current occupant and her quote-unquote sister, Zarina Katerin Boka, who was responsible for exiling her from her native land to the Chaos Wastes. Now, without going too deep into her lore for this video, let's just touch on those 2 magic items that were mentioned, that were given to her by Slaanesh himself. The Rod of Spite. Any victim that comes into contact with the wielder of the staff is confronted by their darkest emotions, amplified to the point of madness. Only the most valiant of heroes can fight on when assaulted by their deepest fears. So this might be an aura that she has, which lowers leadership, or also causes rampage, or perhaps this works very much like Arball's mechanic, where she can then turn somebody into a chaos spawn of Slaanesh. Mostly I just want to see that mechanic used by at least one other character from each god, besides Khorne. It should have been used for the Mutilith Vortex beast, but I digress. Then the Globe of Malice is an evil artifact, radiating a magical aura that fills all who see it with the desire to own it, at any cost. In battle, Nastasya will casually toss the globe into an enemy unit who immediately fall on each other in frenzied struggle to possess it. So I think this should be a missile ability that she has, and I would almost treat it like something between a Deathglow Bombardier's attack and actually the Arachnarop Web Flinger. So maybe it puts a gaseous aura around it when she throws this globe. And everybody around it takes some damage as they are like fighting each other essentially, but also it will cause debuffs to them at the same time and perhaps even leadership penalties. Now, because she is part Kislevite, though we do know that they are going to get a race rework at some point in 2025, which is great news because they didn't get one really in Shadows of Change. But with that being said, I don't think she'll be part of the Mono God Quartet if we ever see her, which I really hope we do. I think she's a very interesting character, either as a legendary lord, but I think probably legendary hero would be maybe more accurate. I would still very much love to see her at some point down the line. And then before we move on from characters completely, we gotta touch on the generic characters. And of course, all we're missing for Slaanesh is the Sorcerer Lord and the Exalted Hero. We already know what these guys do as far as, the other mono gods and warriors. So, this is just the Slaanesh version of those guys. The two models I put on I thought were pretty unique. We got the Exalted Hero of Tzeentch had a very unique aesthetic. And then Nurgle, I was expecting something along the lines of Putrid Blight Lords. But we didn't quite get something all that unique in my opinion. So, yeah, like this Exalted Hero with the, Chain Whip, and the Sorcerer Lord with the giant horns, very demonette looking face. I think those would be great options. And then lastly, we gotta talk about what the units are. So, as far as what Slaanesh is still missing, it's really just what's on this page here. I've talked about before how, I'd like to see cultists, like kind of slave tier units, tier 0 units, for all the Chaos factions. Norska getting bondsmen, and then, all the Chaos factions getting cultists. And, one or two variants, one melee variant, one bow variant, and maybe even a cavalry variant, but very low tier, below Marauder tier. And then, of course, we could get different flavors of giants for the mono gods, different flavors of dragons for the mono gods, and even the great spined chaos beast, which is not something we currently have yet. But all of those could really be chalked up to variants anyways that could come in another patch or FLC or DLC. But for this DLC, I think we're going to get two Beastman units. I think we're going to get Slaangors. That's an obvious shoe-in because we already got the other marked Gors. But I think if Centigors of Tzeentch happened, then we need Centigors of Slaanesh. I would also like them to be flavored as sort of the image I have, which is like a half lion, half, goat thing, jackal. But to say that their flavor is a little more Ind-based rather than Old World-based, I think that could be very interesting, especially since Dechala should start in Ind. Then I also think it's a shoe-in that we'll get the Monstrous Cavalry, because Slaanesh is the only one that's missing it. So Serpent Knights and Pleasure Seekers make a whole lot of sense. Though, of course, they could just call them Pleasure Knights as well. At 90 plus speed, they would be the fastest Monstrous Cavalry, and with their slithering animations would cause a lot of disruption to enemy infantry blobs. Then I would very much like to see bow units in general for Chaos, but Hellstriders with bows would be a top tier unit, an absolute top tier unit. At very, very high speeds, good luck catching these guys before they whittle you down with arrows. Then it may be likely that we get the Basilisk, even though I could argue that this monster could come for Nurgle or just the regular Warriors of Chaos. It is a very fast unit, so it could also work for Slaanesh. But yeah, very high speeds, poison damage, would have a terrifying gaze that might lock enemies in place, and also would have probably a damaging aura, much like a Jabberslythe, in that their very presence is like toxic. And then two kind of more wild ball options. I think a Medusa is very much in line with Slaanesh and the DLC, so seeing a Medusa of Slaanesh I think could be very interesting, having a ranged monster artillery. And then there is the Dreadmaw, which I hope is saved one day for a Koresh race DLC. But we don't know if that'll happen, so perhaps it could come to the Slaanesh roster, as again, anything Serpentine is going to very much fit this DLC. And it is a Chaos Beast in nature. Beyond that, any other units would have to deal with elves. You know, I still would like to see an aspiring champion for every single mono god. Putrid Blight Kings for Nurgle. We got the Wrathmongers for Khorne. For Tzeentch, I would do the Raven Host and match it along with T'Charzanec from Age of Reckoning. For Slaanesh, you could look at AOS units like Myrmidesh Pangbringers or Symbaresh Twin Souls for inspiration, or they could go the route of introducing the Anointed of Slaanesh, which are fantasy lore. Basically, this would be a small unit like an aspiring champion, but for Slaanesh, 16 to 32 entities. They would be made of essentially marked elves of Slaanesh. Very elite, very high stats, very fast at 40, maybe even 50 speed, and would be very good against infantry. Now, for some honorable mentions before I go, these are unlikely non-Slaanesh monsters. The first being the Praeton, which is a Beastman unit that would essentially be much like a Wyvern or a Terrorgeist or Manticore. It is a flying single-entity monster that does poison attacks. But I would kind of like this alongside maybe a Beastman DLC or FLC, because I would also like it if the Praeton was a mount for great Bray Shamans. Then we have the Chimera, which is a three-headed Manticore essentially for the Warriors of Chaos roster. It would also have poison attacks, but be able to breathe fire, and also may buff allied spellcasters or debuff enemy spellcasters in its aura or vicinity. The Warpfire Dragon is another Warriors of Chaos unit. It is a dragon that has consumed raw warpstone, and in turn has two major abilities. So first is it would have the most powerful breath attack in the game, as its breath is said to be like no other dragon's, a coruscating blast of scintillating red-black lightning that burns its victims in all-consuming flames, scorching even spirits and creatures of magic. But it is also said to have an aura about it, which would essentially be like a Mortis engine, so it would be constantly dealing damage to enemies caught within its vicinity. Then for some ones you may not have heard of, the Bonnekin is a bull-like creature, but it is also said to have a horse-like mane that hails from Ulthuan and is tamed by Druchii Beastmasters. It is said to be very fast and have an aura of noxious fumes, so it may, again, work like a Mortis engine, or maybe it is just a debuff aura like River Trolls. Now, I've talked about before how the Greenskins could and should get gigantic spiders, essentially monstrous cavalry-sized spiders. And within this category of sized spiders, there are known to be Chaos Cave Spiders, which are gigantic-sized spiders that have been mutated by Chaos. How so? I am not sure, but that could be an interesting unit. And then finally, The Artois boars hail from the Forest of Arden and would essentially be a reskin of the Things in the Woods from the Kislev roster, so some fast-moving medium beasts that would be good against infantry. There's only one unit, really, from Age of Sigmar or 40k that is missing from Slaanesh Fantasy, and I've talked about this before. I have no issue with using Age of Sigmar or 40k units for the Demons of Chaos, because that is how they were designed to be used in the first place, that they could cross between the different universes of Warhammer. So that unit is the Contorted Epitome, which could essentially be a more elite version of the Chaos War Shrine of Slaanesh, in that it might be double or triple the speed and may have an additional passive ability or bound spells from the lore of Slaanesh, and perhaps even summons of demonettes. And that should about cover everything I could possibly think of for Slaanesh. Tell me in the comments what you think. If you like this video, please like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, bye.